Hello, friends at the Community Unitarian Universalist Church of New Smyrna Beach. It's a pleasure to be back with you guys, speaking with you on your regular Sunday service. I have to say this is not my preferred way of speaking with folks. I had to teach online for half a semester in the spring at the college, and it worked out okay. But even then, I didn't have to actually record a lecture in the way in which this is being recorded. So we'll see how this works. I'm not entirely optimistic. And the times are not great times. We're struggling with the pandemic, and it seems like our political leadership is completely over its head. We are in the midst of an economic crisis with unemployment levels, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Depression, and that doesn't show any signs of getting better in the short term. And we are dealing with a reckoning with America's original sin, the systemic and structural racism that we need to address, and it's time we did, but it's coming at a tough time. So I gather you guys have been speaking about race in America in recent Sundays, and the truth is I don't know anything about economics, so I'm going to try to say something about the third of those things going on right now, that is the pandemic. I'd like to approach it from a more historical angle, because I think it can shed some light and suggest ways in which we can think about it more constructively than we might otherwise. Plagues have been around for forever in human history. We know of thousands of years of them, and presumably prehistoric times had their plagues as well, of which we know nothing. Every society that finds itself afflicted with this kind of catastrophic contagion has to deal with it, in concrete, practical ways. They have to try to slow the progress of the disease. They have to try to treat the sick. They have to dispose of the dead. And in these concrete ways, one thing that's amazing to me is how similar those are across the ages, so far as we can judge these things. But we are not only a practical species, we are also a meaning-making species, and we want to understand. And so each society has to have its own story about what's going on in a plague, a story about what's causing it, a story to tell where it came from, what, if anything, we can learn from it about ourselves, about our relationship to each other, about our relation to the cosmos. I said there have been plenty of pandemics historically. Let me see if I can make this screen share thing work and go to a case thereof. Here you see a pictorial representation. I like this. That's kind of a time, that white carpet going backwards, that's going backwards in time. And each of these furry balls is some kind of bacillus or bacteria or something representing a plague. The sizes don't show up right in this perspectival drawing, but if you look down here, you can see this big purple one. That represents the Black Death. That is the bubonic plague that hit Europe in the 1340s, 1347 or so. And it's huge. It's the biggest of the bunch. Followed by a smallpox epidemic from the 16th century, the Spanish flu in the beginning of the 20th century here in green. The plague of Justinian, we don't really know how big that was, but estimations put it there. And the HIV/AIDS epidemic, might be surprised how big that is relative to all of the plagues of human history. And going down, we see our COVID-19 pandemic, this little guy right here. Of course, it's not over yet, but that's where it is relative to the size of various plagues that we've been afflicted by in the past. I'm going to talk today about the plague of the 14th century and ways in which they understood it and ways in which they sought to make meaning in the midst of it, and then turn and talk a little bit about ways in which we understand these things in more recent times. When I say in more recent times, I mean actually not just right now, but the 20th century, because I want to use two works of art. I call them works of art. One is a literary work and one is a film from the 20th century as evidence of ways in which there are similarities and great differences in the meaning that different times and places and cultures make in the midst of pandemics. So that's the thesis of today's talk. I'm going to say something about how remarkably similar our concrete relations, our concrete ways of dealing with this phenomenon are, and how remarkably different our ways of understanding it can be. That's the hope. So before I get into this any further, let me say COVID-19 is not the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague killed 200 million people maybe in the world. We don't know exactly, of course, but it was unbelievably lethal. It was also very contagious. And it was lethal on a scale and across cities and towns and across populations and generations in a way in which, thank God, COVID-19 has not yet proven to be. And if you got the bubonic plague, you probably died of it. This is mercifully not the case with our coronavirus. But I want to make sure that you understand that I understand that these are not really so similar, except in the fact that they are worldwide contagions, diseases that are causing big problems and that, at least at this stage, we don't know how to deal with. That we share with the people of the 14th century. We don't have a lot of records from the 14th century, of course, but we do have a couple of literary works from the period, and we can learn something from those, I think. So just a moment. This is a quote from Boccaccio's Decameron. He lived through the plague in Florence in 1348, and he and a group of friends were isolated, quarantined basically, and he spent his time more productively than most of us are spending our times in lockdown. He wrote the Decameron, which is a series of nearly 100 stories, mostly bawdy stories, mostly sex-filled stories. After all, this is a bunch of young men locked in a room with nothing to do. So what do? They drink, they talk about sex. And it's a fascinating collection of stories. I'd recommend it to you, but I'm just interested in this first paragraph where we get in one concentrated form some of the views that people held at the time. In 1348, when in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence which, whether disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies or sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath by way of retribution for our iniquities, had its origin some years before in the East, whence, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so calamitously had spread into the West. So look at this paragraph, it's really interesting. Two possible explanations for this plague, right? Maybe it was disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies. You might think, what in the world is that about? That's astrology, which was big in the Middle Ages, of course. And as an example here, check out from a paragraph from Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. When the King of France sought to understand the cause of the plague, the medical faculty at the University of Paris blamed a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius, which had occurred on March 20th, 1345. This is some serious astrological lore. You get the alignment of 3 planets in the 40th degree of the sign Aquarius, the zodiac, at a particular time, and it portends bad stuff coming. And the plague is one of those bad things. So maybe it was a matter of the alignment of the planets. Maybe it's astrologically caused. Or, note, sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath, by way of retribution for our iniquities. Now that's another much more popular explanation for the plague. We are being punished for our sins. God has had enough of our wicked ways, and he's going to make us pay the price. This made the plague make sense, since, of course, every society has plenty of sinners committing plenty of sins. And if some horrible calamity has come upon one, then it makes sense to explain it as the just punishment from a wrathful God. And plagues have biblical resonance anyway, because you remember when the Israelites were trying to get out of Egypt, God sent a series of plagues upon them, one of which was indeed disease. And so there's a biblical resonance there. This was a very popular explanation, and you've probably heard of the way in which people would go from village to village in Europe during the plague, literally whipping themselves or whipping each other, and trying in an effort to mortify the flesh, in an effort to make clear the degree of their remorse for their sins, their penitence, the sincerity of their penitence, in hopes that God would take away the plague that was afflicting them. This makes sense if you think what's going on with the plague is that we're being punished for our sins. It seeks to mollify the enraged God. Also here in this description from Boccaccio, a mention of the fact that it came from the east. You see in this map here, approaching from Asia, this is from the Silk Roads, for example, gets to the Black Sea, gets loaded, goods and wares and silks and such spices are loaded onto ships, brought down through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, into the Mediterranean and on to Europe. And we think that most of the spread of the plague came through those trade routes from the east through the Black Sea into Western Europe. Now, a really interesting thing, interesting to me anyway, is that we now think we know how the plague was propagated from person to person, from place to place in the Middle Ages. We think it was mostly carried by fleas. Fleas would bite infected rats, suck the blood of those rats, then bite human beings, transfer the bacillus to the human beings, and that's the way in which the contagion was passed. But people didn't know that. People had no idea how this worked. They had vague notions that the plague is spread by miasma, which was foul air somehow. And so you wanted to keep from being exposed to foul air or telluric influence, very unclear notions, but they did know that it was contagious because they knew that until it came to one person in the city wouldn't be afflicted. But once one person got it, the city was headed for epidemic infections. So they knew it was infectious. They didn't know. This was centuries and centuries, 500 years before microbial theories of disease. The idea that there are tiny little bacilli that you can't see that get in your bloodstream and make you sick, that was the farthest thing from their minds. But they knew it was contagious, and they knew that to try to do something about it, they needed to try to address the contagion. We don't have a lot by way of visual representations from the actual time, but there are a couple, and I wanted to show them to you. They're pretty interesting. This is the citizens of Tournai burying the dead during the Black Death in the 14th century. Visually, artistically, not very good, but you can see lots of folks over there on the left carrying coffins. You can see folks digging graves over here with the spades. These two lowering coffins into graves. The general impression this painting gives is lots of dead folks, difficulty in getting them all buried, and that's what presumably the artist wanted to convey. This is from a miniature from an illuminated manuscript, so it's not expected to be a great artwork. One more, not irrelevant. This is also from the 1340s. Over here, we have a group of people in a fire. This is the Jews of the town being burned alive because, as often happens during afflictions, a group of a despised minority of some sort gets blamed for it. And then the idea is if we can get rid of them, we'll get rid of the pestilence. And a handy, available group for persecution in this way in medieval Europe, of course, was the Jews. So here we have the Jews of the town being burned alive in hopes of dispelling the plague. I think you can think of your own parallels today without my having to focus in on the despised minorities that are getting blamed, and the foreigners and the other that's getting blamed these days. Oh, sorry. You can see they are, in the prior picture, they were burying the dead. This is something that always has to be done in the course of a pandemic. One must dispose of the bodies of the dead. There are other efforts as well, trying to slow down the progress of the disease. And I won't go into great detail here, but it's really interesting what they did at the time in the effort to slow down the progress of the disease. So for example, if a person was afflicted in a house, that house was nailed shut with everyone in the house, and the people were forbidden to emerge from the house except in the late evening hours to bring out the dead, or first thing in the morning to bring out the dead. Other than that, the house was sealed, and the people, presumably mostly, though not entirely, died in those houses. But it did have the effect of quarantining the infected, and presumably it had the effect of slowing down the spread. They had mass burials. You brought out your dead either in the morning or in the evening, and there would be a cart going through the street picking up the dead, and they would be there buried after dark or before dawn in the morning. And in order to make sure that people didn't come out to attend the burial, one, because the burials were not pretty, they were mass graves mass ditches into which bodies had to be flung because of the numbers, but also because these bodies were themselves a possible source of contagion, and you didn't want the whole community coming out to be present at the burials. This kind of quarantine is a very old idea, as you can see, not entirely unlike our lockdowns today, though fortunately our disease is not so serious. But what's interesting to me is that we can recognize the similarities in the efforts to slow down the spread, even though they had no idea what was causing the actual spread, even though their ideas were about astrological influences or about the wrath of an angry God. Still, the practical measures were pretty similar. In addition, this is so interesting. If this is brought on by miasma, by foul smells, then you might want to keep those foul smells away from your nose. So you would put things in front of your face that would have herbs or spices or some kind of strong essential oils to keep the bad smells away. And so you had people covering their faces, not unlike ways in which we do masks. I really like the following parallel. You can see on the right, full hazmat, personal protective gear, equipment. Over on the left, you have the plague doctor. When the doctor would go from house to house, inspecting possible plague victims and certifying them as indeed infected by the plague, they looked like this. Up on top, Dr. Schnabel from Rome. Schnabel is the German word for beak. And as you can see, he has something like a bird's beak, and you wonder, what in the world is that about? That beak is filled with herbs or spices or essential oils or something so that he's not directly breathing the miasmatic air around him. And down here in the bottom in German, it says Kleidung wider den Tod zu Rom. Dress against death, it's called. A famous way in which the people of that time tried to make meaning out of their experience was this trope, I guess we would call it these days, the dance of death, the danse macabre. It's really interesting. You'll see here we have people from differing stations in life. Here we have a pope or a cardinal. Here we have the king. Here we have a royal lady, moving on down to a squire maybe, and there's more to the painting over here on the right, but it won't fit on my screen. Down to regular folks, peasants and serfs. And the idea is that the dance of death, everybody is doing the dance of death together. You can see skeletons or skin and bone, skeletons with some kind of skin, this guy carrying a coffin, and the dead are leading the living into purgatory, into death. And there's a kind of a quasi-humorous element here, right? That death should be a dance. Dances are entertaining, dances are fun, dances are things you do for fun. In this case, not so much. But the point of these mostly was that in death and in being condemned to death, we are all, as we say, in the same boat. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that back then, as now, it's not true that everybody was in the same boat, because some folks were wealthy and able to seclude themselves or able to move out of the city into their house in the country. There were ways to make oneself less likely to be infected by the plague, but no guarantees. And to a certain extent, it is true that all stations, high and low, the clerics and the royalty and common folk, were all subject to the plague together. And this got expressed over and over in this motif of the dance of death, the danse macabre. A similar sort of plague hit London in 1665. And Daniel Defoe, the same guy who wrote Robinson Crusoe, wrote a book called The Journal of the Plague Year. It was decades after the plague, but he got all the records he could to try to make it accurate. And interestingly, he included in that some of the orders that the aldermen of the city handed down regulating the city during the plague. I won't spend long on this. I can see I'm running out of time. You would sequester the sick. As soon as somebody is found to be sick, he's sequestered in the same house. That basically meant he was locked into his house with everyone else in the family. His stuff and goods, including his bedding and apparel and such, would not be used until they were well aired with fire. We're not sure if that meant they burned them up or there was some kind of smoke treatment that was supposed to take away the infection. Then they shut up the house. And I mentioned that about burying of the dead. That same routine goes down in London in 1665, that the burial takes place before the sun rising or after sun setting, with just the church wardens or constable and nobody else, no neighbors or friends. Think about our present situation when you read this next one. That all plays, bear baitings, games, singing of ballads, buckler play, I don't know what that is, or such like causes of assemblies of people are utterly prohibited. So no public entertainments, no concerts, that sort of thing. That all public feastings in dinners at taverns and such are prohibited. That disorderly tippling in taverns, alehouses, coffee houses, and cellars be severely looked into as the common sin of this time and the greatest occasion of dispersing the plague. I hope you hear our current concerns about young folks going to bars, having a drink or two, losing their inhibitions, and ceasing to act in accordance with the CDC issued guidelines for behavior in public. It's just fascinating to me how similar all this sounds, whether it's in the 14th century, whether it's in the 17th century, or whether it's today. Also in the time of the plague in 1665, just came across this. This is a document called the Bills of Mortality for a certain year. And this page is from a certain week, diseases and casualties of the week. And it's just fascinating. If you look down, I hope you can see this. You've got fever, 309 deaths, flux and smallpox, 5. Love this one. Griping in the guts caused the death of 51 people, etc., etc. But over here, oh rats, you can't see it. Here we go. The plague 7,165 people in a week killed by the plague at its height in London. So you can see all of the different ways in which one might have died at the time. And the plague was completely out of its appropriate scale in terms of causing death. And that's the way plagues are, right? I don't want to belabor the parallels, but I was interested in Newsweek to come across a story. If I can get this to go. Conservative pastor says coronavirus spreading in synagogues is God's punishment to Jews for opposing Jesus Christ. That's in March 26 of 2020. Not suggesting that this is a widespread view these days, but it was there and it was reported in Newsweek. I made a lot out of the fact that they didn't know what was happening, these folks at the time, because there was nothing like what we called medical science at the time. And I mean, nothing like what we call medical science. And there was astrological explanation, there was theological explanation, and there was very little else. Things are different now, right? Nowadays, we have a remarkably detailed scientific understanding of the microbial causes of disease. Since the middle 19th century, we've had a beginnings of a microbial theory of disease, and it gets spelled out more and more, so that within the first weeks of this pandemic now, we had not only knowledge of that it was caused by a virus, more or less where that virus came from, but and this is amazing to me, the DNA of the virus itself quickly analyzed, quickly discerned, and quickly propagated to anyone who had a need to know. And we all hope that we will get a vaccine and that this problem will solve itself pretty soon. We all hope that. I certainly hope that. But the meaning that we attach to a plague these days is very different from that in the 14th century or in the 17th century. At least it seems so to me. Although some of the same motifs, and that's really interesting to me too, come back even now. I just showed you that story from Newsweek about the pastor, conservative pastor, who thinks the Jews are bringing this upon themselves for opposing Jesus. But when you don't have a theologically based account of reality, as lots of modern secular folks don't, I suppose in a Unitarian church, we have all shades of theism and atheism and agnosticism and everything in between. But what we don't have is a unified belief in a theological account of what's going on in the case of, say, a plague. Rather, we have a scientific account, and a scientific account is different from a theological account. We secular, modern scientific types don't tend to see diseases in moral terms at all, really. Sure, there are preachers who thought the HIV/AIDS disease came upon people because of their wicked homosexual or intravenous drug using ways. But most of us don't think that anymore. We think diseases are working out of the laws of nature. You got physics, you got chemistry, you got biology. The laws of each of them basically might as well be mathematics. They work themselves out. Diseases emerge, evolutionary laws, random variation followed by natural selection. This is what you get. It isn't the result of the wrath of an angry God. And we're not likely to improve things by placating the wrath of that angry God. That changes the whole way. Well, the fact that we have a scientific understanding of the disease and the fact that we don't have that understanding theologically embedded in a cosmic moral story changes the whole perspective on what a pandemic is. So when we have dramas these days, I don't know, think of the movie Contagion, for example. The drama is not, can we satisfy God in time for him not to bring down all of humanity? The drama is, can we, through our scientific research, find the cure and dispense it quickly enough so as to save humankind in that way? That's a very different kind of narrative. And we don't think in terms of God having sent the disease. And if we did, most of us, I speak for myself, but I bet I speak for a lot of Unitarians, would want to know how come a good God sends that kind of indiscriminate punishment upon people guilty and innocent of all kinds, especially innocent children, for example, who also die horrible deaths in the plague, and occasionally, I suppose, even in this pandemic. So when we start thinking about this in theological terms, our response is very different. It's not, how can we get right with God? It's, how could he do this if he's really supposed to be a good and just God? That changes things. That changes the meaning that one finds in the pandemic. And in that context, I notice I'm running out of time, as I always do. I want to mention two works from the 20th century that I think are just so good and so brilliant at raising these questions, raising the difference between plague in a time of skepticism and doubt and more rationalistic scientific understanding, and plague in the old days. First, I was going to show you brief excerpts, but I won't have time, is a film by Ingmar Bergman called The Seventh Seal, 1957. It's set in the time of the medieval plague. A squire is returning from the Crusades. He gets to Europe. Europe is infected with the plague. Death comes to get him, and he challenges death to a chess game. And so this chess game lasts a couple of weeks. And during that time, we get to see what the landscape of Europe during the plague looks like. And he is all the while trying to find the voice of God, trying to find some meaning in this, trying to understand whether he was doing the right thing going to the Crusades, but more than that, why Europe has been subjected to this pain. And all the while, death is following him around and they're playing chess. It's so good. I can't tell you how good it is. It's about an hour and a half long. It's available for free on YouTube. Do yourself a favor. The other, it's in Swedish, but it has English subtitles. It's just fabulous. The other work I want to call to your attention is a novel by Albert Camus, The Plague. Takes place in coastal Africa, Oran, coast of Algeria, in 1945. And the plague appears there in a town called Oran. And this is a first-person narrative by one of the characters who lives through the plague there in the town. And I can't tell you what a fine novel it is because of the writing itself, of course. Camus won the Nobel Prize. But the questions it raises and the way it raises them and the way it harkens back to the difficulties in understanding that the medieval folks had, and yet is thoroughly modern. It's a brilliant, brilliant work. So it has a preacher, Father Panelu, in whose first sermon, which occurs on page 94, he opens it up with, "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserve it." And he goes on to explain, the first time this scourge appears in history, it was wielded to strike down the enemies of God. Pharaoh set himself up against the divine will, and the plague beat him to his knees. Thus, from the dawn of recorded history, the scourge of God has humbled the proud of heart and laid low those who hardened themselves against him. Ponder this well, my friends, and fall on your knees. Great stuff. So anyway, Dr. Roux, who is a rationalist, secular type, doesn't believe in his theological stuff. And he thinks if there is a God, that God ought to be ashamed of himself, because the doctor sees that this plague is afflicting the guilty, the innocent, the young, the old. People indiscriminately. This can't be punishment for anything because it's basically random. There are other people's perspectives. Father Panelu and Dr. Roux get into it with each other on this question. And in the end, Camus manages to make meaning out of the suffering of the people of the town of Oran as they go through the plague, as friends and family die around them in great numbers. Find meaning in terms of human solidarity when you realize that we're all, after all, under a sentence of death. When you realize that we're all more or less ignorant of how we got here and why we're here and where we're going. On Camus' reading, that's reason enough for us to stick together, to fight against death to the extent that we can, knowing that it will always be a losing battle, but to Camus' mind, that's no reason not to fight it. In fact, there is dignity, there is valor in the fighting of it, even though we know ultimately we'll lose. It's a great quote from elsewhere of Camus. He's talking about our scientific worldview, according to which our planet is like a speck of dust, and we're like little mites on a speck of dust. And ultimately, our sun's going to burn out, and we're going to be destined to nothing. We're going to completely disappear. And he says, if this is our destiny, let us at least not live as if that's what we deserve. I think that's one of the great lines in which someone takes the sort of cosmic meaninglessness of the human condition as revealed by contemporary science, or suggested by contemporary science, and rather than let it turn into a reason for despair, on the contrary, turns it into a reason for solidarity, for working together, for loving one another, and being supportive, and at least not living as if that's what we deserve. I had other things to say about this wonderful novel, but I hope you'll just read it yourself. I do, however, want to read the last paragraph because it's one of the great paragraphs in literature. The plague is over. They finally open the gates of the town. People are celebrating. And indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy rising from the town, Rue remembered that such joy is always imperiled. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, and that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of mankind, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. I just think that's such a good paragraph. At any rate, finding meaning of a different kind in the plague from that which was found by our ancestors in the Middle Ages, but similar affliction, understood differently, responded to in similar ways, something to be learned from the historical perspective, as is always the case. I apologize for running over. I always run over. I thank you for your attention. I hope you found some of this interesting, and most of all, I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity. Go watch The Seventh Seal. Go read The Plague. These are two of really, I don't want to get exaggerating here, but two of the great works of human creativity. Okay, thanks guys. I guess I'll see you virtually after this video plays on WebEx or a Zoom. I hope so. Anyway, thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.